As the year moves forward, police departments all over the world are hard at work to crack the cold cases that have remained unsolved for decades. No matter how much time has passed, when a cold case is solved, a family out there gains closure after years of fighting for justice. Here are some of the cold cases solved so far in 2025. The body of 86-year-old Una Crown was found on January 13th of 2013. When her nephew-in-law John went to her house to collect her for Sunday lunch, he encountered a horrifying scene. Una was laying in a pool of blood, and her body had severe burns, the smell of burnt skin and fabric still lingering in the air. However, despite the bizarre scene found inside the home, police immediately ruled Una's death an accident and gave way to an incredibly flawed investigation that turned Una's death into a cold case that lasted for over a decade. Una Crown, whose birth date remains unclear but is said to be sometime between 1926 and 1927, lived in Cambridgeshire, England. Una lived alone. After losing her husband in 2009 and with no children of their own, the retired postmistress kept a quiet life. She had a few friends and kept close contact with her niece, who described her as a sweet lady who wasn't afraid to speak her mind. On January 13th, her niece and husband were to take her out for Sunday lunch, so around mid-morning, John Payne, her nephew-in-law, arrived at her bungalow to pick her up. Nobody answered the door, and the curtains were drawn, which raised the first red flag for John. It wasn't like Una to be late and not come to the door. After living alone for a few years, Una had grown concerned for her safety, so she always locked her doors properly. Seeing as he was getting no response and all doors were locked, John went to a neighbor's house knowing that he had a spare key to Una's house. And as soon as he entered the bungalow, he knew the worst had happened. Una was on the floor of the hallway, lying face down in a pool of blood. It seemed like the blood was coming from her neck. But what caught John's attention most was the smell. Burnt newspaper surrounded Una, who also had burns on her skin and clothes. The fire had seemed to extinguish itself, leaving the rest of the house untouched. John immediately called 999 to report the emergency, and described the scene to the operator as something weird had happened. Police were quick to arrive at the scene, but as soon as they stepped into the home, things went downhill. Upon their first inspection, the two attending police officers didn't consider the death as suspicious as John had. Their initial investigation concluded that Una had accidentally set herself on fire while using the stove. She must have been making something when the stove caught on fire, and she tried to put it out with a tea towel. Her clothes caught on fire too, causing her to have a heart attack. The cuts on her throat were explained as injuries caused by the body falling on the floor. Since the case was treated like an accident, there was no crime scene. Police, firefighters, paramedics, and funeral services walked in and out around the house all day, touching and moving Una's body and everything around it. In fact, one of the firefighters raised concerns at the time about how the house was being treated, since the circumstances still seemed strange and everyone was walking around a potential crime scene. And these concerns were right on point. 2 days later, on January 15th, Una's body was taken for an autopsy, during which it was determined her cause of death was stabbing. Those cuts on her neck were in no way injuries from falling, but deliberate stab wounds. This, of course, changed everything, and the case turned into a murder investigation. Someone had stabbed Una to death and tried to burn her body to get rid of evidence. Of course, by this point, the fact that the fire hadn't caught properly wasn't a problem to remove evidence, since the evidence had been heavily compromised when Una's house wasn't secured as a crime scene and was filled with people from the beginning. Key evidence like DNA, fibers, or fingerprints had been lost forever. This theory also made more sense once the house was investigated again, and police noted that Una's wedding ring, her front door key, and some cash were missing from her belongings. Everything was starting to look like a robbery gone wrong. The poor judgment from the first police officers meant that this new investigation had to rely only on witnesses and little to no evidence to find who killed Una Crown. Reconstructing Una's last movements also proved difficult without any evidence. She had last been seen outside on January 11th, and the following day, the last contact anyone had with her was when she spoke on the phone to a neighbor around 5 p.m. She mentioned having finished her dinner and settling in to watch TV. Sometime after that, and before the next morning when John found her, someone had entered her home and killed her. During the next few months, several neighbors were interviewed, some even arrested in hopes to find out who killed Una Crown. But with no evidence to back any of the accusations, every suspect was released, and the case began going cold. Her family was starting to fear they would never find out what happened to Una and who was responsible for her death. The flawed investigation had compromised any clues that pointed at the killer, and that was tremendously frustrating for them. It wasn't until 2023, 10 years later, when the case was revisited with the intention of finally solving it. The new detective in charge was aware of the problematic investigation that was initially made, and decided to retest what little evidence they did have. During the autopsy, Una's nail clippings had been collected, which were covered in blood. However, a more thorough look into these clippings revealed that there were traces of DNA under them, suggesting Una had fought back against her attacker. When the DNA was run, it returned a match. David Newton, a neighbor of Una's who was often hired to do odd jobs around the houses in the neighborhoods. The same David Newton who had been arrested and interviewed back in 2013, when the first investigation was still open, but released due to lack of evidence. As they looked into David Newton's history, they saw a series of disturbing events. One of Una's relatives had him over in her house to buy some raffle tickets, and afterwards, thinking he had already left, she went to her bedroom to get changed. David hadn't actually left the house and walked into her room when she was changing. Another neighbor who had hired him for a few jobs around the house mentioned he sometimes crept to her window at night and watched her sleep. And despite asking him to stop several times, he continued to lurk around her house. Overall, David Newton was known as a strange man, often drunk, who made people feel very uncomfortable. An arrest order was issued, but David was not arrested until April of 2024, when he was finally apprehended and charged with Una's murder. His trial took place in January of 2025, and although it revealed more details about the circumstances surrounding Una's murder, it didn't clear up everything. David Newton had a history of trespassing into other people's homes, and it seemed that in Una's case, he had done the same. He had a copy of her key made months earlier when she hired him to change her locks. This explained the lack of signs of forced entry, as well as the fact that her door was locked when she was found. However, during his trial, David denied wanting to kill her when he entered the house. In fact, he gave no information about his motives. However, he didn't deny killing or attacking her either. The reconstruction of what little crime scene was left untouched painted the following picture. As she was watching TV, David used his key to enter the house. Una was startled to see him come in, and a phone left off the hook suggested that she tried to call for help at some point. However, how he reached the point of stabbing her to death and how he attempted to burn evidence away remains unclear, since David refused to give more details throughout his trial. The missing cash from her purse did, however, match David's steps after killing her and leaving her house. On January 15th, David made a deposit of £80 to his bank account, the same amount missing from Una's purse, and the only deposit David had done in months. The DNA from Una Crown's fingernails was enough to find him guilty, and in February of 2025, 70-year-old David Newton was finally convicted of murder and has been sentenced to a minimum of 21 years in prison. Although the family will never forget these torturous 10 years, they are at least relieved that the man who did this is now behind bars. Stephen Edenfield was supposed to go to his mother's house on the morning of February 1st, 1997, but when he didn't show up and never picked up the phone, his brother decided to go check on him. When he arrived at Stephen's condo, his brother James found the door unlocked, signs of struggle all over the home, and finally, in the bedroom, what he never imagined to find. His brother was lying dead under a blanket, surrounded by blood. On the bedroom wall, a single word had been spelled out with the same blood: greed. It would take nearly 3 decades to discover exactly what happened to Stephen. 41-year-old Stephen Edenfield lived in a condo complex in Tampa. He had a close relationship with his sisters and brother, as well as his mother, all of whom lived around the same apartment complex, allowing them to get together for dinners frequently, and giving their mother the care that she needed due to her health issues after having a stroke. On January 31st, Stephen, his brother, and one of his sisters had dinner together with their mother in her apartment. After dinner, at around 9 p.m., Stephen told his brother he was going out for some drinks and would be back early in the morning to check on his mother. Stephen was openly gay, but he was very private with the details of who he was dating, so his brother James didn't know who he was going out with or if he was meeting anyone. They said their goodbyes and Stephen left the apartment. The next morning, February 1st, James got a call from his mother while he was at work. Stephen hadn't shown up to her apartment like he promised, and he wasn't answering his phone. James started calling his brother as well, but also encountered no answer on the other side of the line. This was very unlike Stephen, so James decided to leave work at 10 a.m. to go check on his brother. As he pulled up to the complex, he noticed Stephen's car parked at his usual spot, which meant he made it home from the bar the night before. However, as he got to the front door, he noticed it was unlocked. Inside, the entire apartment had been turned upside down. Broken furniture was lying on the floor. Items from shelves shattered all over the place. Something happened in here, and James began fearing the worst. Nobody answered when he called out for Stephen, so James walked into the bedroom, where all the curtains were drawn, and his brother seemed to be in the bed. As he pulled back the blanket set over Stephen, he realized why he wasn't answering back. He was extremely cold to the touch, no pulse at all. As his eyes focused on the dim light, he noticed the blood all around the room. Panicked, James ran out of the apartment to find the building's main office and asked them to call 911. Police arrived to the apartment complex shortly after the call and began investigating the scene. Stephen was laid on his back in the bed, nude and with stab and blunt force trauma wounds to his torso and stomach. The blood from his wounds had reached the floor, the headboard, and some of the walls. Blood-stained clothes were collected from the scene, including a tank top and a pair of socks. But the most chilling piece of evidence was written on the wall, using Stephen's own blood: greed. A single word that suggested something very disturbing happened inside that apartment. While the physical evidence was collected, agents decided to speak to the neighbors. The woman who lived directly below Stephen's apartment said she heard loud noises around 1 a.m, like someone was fighting. She also heard furniture breaking. However, very quickly, things went quiet, so she didn't report it. The complex had a nighttime security guard that did rounds and kept an eye on the main gate. The guard confirmed he had seen Stephen return to his apartment at midnight. He asked to be let in since he had forgotten his gate remote control, and since the security guard knew him well, he opened up for him. However, Stephen told him to also let in the car that was behind him, since they were traveling together. The guard looked at the other car and caught a glimpse of a white man with dark hair, but since he trusted Stephen, he let the other person in without checking them out any further. Guests were allowed after all, and Stephen and his family were well known in the community. There was no reason to doubt him. Around 2 a.m, while doing one of his rounds, the security guard noticed someone moving in one of the balconies, but when he tried to get a better look, the person went down a different staircase. Then, the guard saw the car that had entered with Stephen earlier leave its parking spot and go out the gate. Once again, thinking it was nothing more than Stephen's guest, he took no notice of the plate number. Retracing Stephen's steps a bit further, the police talked to the bartender that served him that night at his usual spot. He had been alone all night, leaving the bar alone as well. Whoever had driven back to his apartment with him, he had not met them at the bar. This meant that sometime between midnight, when the security guard let him in, and 2 a.m. when he saw the same car leave, something happened inside Stephen's apartment. Something loud enough to wake the downstairs neighbor. All these details seemed to give the police a clear view of what happened. There was just one problem. Nobody had seen this mystery man's face or his license plate. The guard didn't get a close enough look at either of them, and also didn't feel like it was suspicious since he was entering with one of the residents. So with no description or number plate to follow, the investigation was doomed from the start. Stephen's dating life was investigated too, but gave no clear answers. It seemed that this was someone Stephen didn't know. Weeks and months went by with no new developments, and very soon those months turned into years. Years which were very tough on the Edenfield family. After her stroke, Stephen's mother had to deal with losing her son. She hung on as long as she could, hoping to see this crime solved, but sadly passed away in 2003 without knowing who took her son from her. One of their sisters died a few years later from brain cancer, and the other sister passed away from kidney failure a year later. James Edenfield, Stephen's brother, was the only immediate family left, fighting to keep this case alive. In 2022, the Sheriff's Office Cold Case Unit reopened the investigation. Like we've seen these past few years, cold case units are revisiting and retesting DNA from cold cases in hopes that the more precise technology, as well as the ever-growing databases, can open up new leads that can solve these cases. And luckily in Stephen's case, that's exactly what happened. Back at the crime scene, detectives found a tank top and a pair of socks stained with blood. Those were filed as evidence, but in 2022, testing them became far more enlightening than it was in 1997. The blood on the clothes was mostly Stephen's, but the lab was able to isolate another DNA profile. This lead gave hope to investigators, who inserted the profile into a database in hopes to find a match. That match would take 2 years to show up, but in 2024, the same DNA was linked to a 2005 sexual assault case in Illinois, and a suspect had been identified. His name was Brandon Glia. Brandon Glia was now 47 years old and a resident of Tampa, but had been arrested weeks before because of the warrant of his arrest in Illinois. So when investigators linked him to Stephen's murder as well, he was already in custody. In January of 2025, a DNA sample was collected from Brandon and matched to the blood found on the tank top and socks at the crime scene of Stephen Edenfield's murder. In an interview after his arrest, Brandon Glia told investigators that a person named Chino had picked him up in a dark brown Monte Carlo. He said that Chino had set him up to have sex with Stephen, and after the encounter, he told Chino he felt violated and angry. Brandon told investigators he heard Chino and Stephen arguing about the payment in the bedroom, so he grabbed a porcelain statue from the living room and threw it at Stephen. When Stephen pushed him, Brandon punched him before Chino came up from behind and stabbed him with a knife. Brandon told investigators that Chino again stabbed Stephen and hit him with a blunt object, because they needed to make sure that he could not rat them out or they'd go to prison. During the attacks, Brandon said he wiped everything down and searched the condo for things to steal, since they didn't receive any money, eventually taking a golden bracelet Stephen was wearing. Brandon continuously said that he did not stab or touch the victim in any manner, aside from throwing the statue at the back of the victim's head and punching him once, which would explain his blood on his clothes. This statement, however, does not match the security guard's version, who only saw one person in the car that followed Stephen in, and the same person leaving the property nearly 2 hours later. The sheriff's office confirmed they were not investigating any other suspects either, since evidence and witness accounts place only one other person there apart from Stephen, and that DNA has confirmed that this person was Brandon. Eventually, in late February, Brandon confessed it was him who stabbed the victim. Brandon Glia is awaiting trial for his crime. And although the pain he's caused to the family is enormous, James Edenfield states he doesn't wish the death penalty on him, but rather watch him rot behind bars for the rest of his life. Early in the morning of March 8, 1998, police were called into a rear parking lot in a Toronto neighborhood. Laying there dead was a 24-year-old Donna Oglive. The autopsy revealed she had been strangled to death, but also that she was 4 months pregnant with a boy. However, finding who killed Donna and her unborn child would take a very long time. Donna Oglive's family had emigrated from the Philippines to Canada, seeking new opportunities when she was just a baby. At 24 years old, Donna had a longtime partner whom she'd been with for 6 years and had a child together. However, life had taken Donna to seek work on the streets, offering her services as a sex worker to pay her bills. Her friends remember her fondly and insisting that although she worked on the streets, Donna was far from trouble. She didn't drink or do drugs. She didn't mix in with the wrong crowds. She just did what she had to do at the time to make ends meet. Not long before March 8th, Donna had found out she was pregnant with her second child, and she decided it was time to make a change. She was planning on moving to Vancouver with her partner and child to find a new job that would allow her to raise her second child as well. That week was her last one on the streets. Sadly, she never got her second chance. When police arrived at the parking lot in the corner of Jarvis and Carlton Streets, they found the young mother with her skirt pulled up, strangled to death. There was no sign of a struggle other than on Donna's body, so police weren't even sure if the murder had taken place in the parking lot or she had been moved later. What they did believe was that it was most likely a client she was with that night who had decided to take her life. At the time, there were no witnesses who had seen Donna with anyone, and no further evidence to aid the investigation. DNA had been collected from Donna's body, but in 1998 there were no criminal databases that could help track down a killer quickly, so the case slowly went cold. While her family and friends always hoped for a breakthrough, that news would take over 25 years to come.
DNA testing was conducted on this case and a male DNA profile was developed. He is not currently in our national DNA databank. What we need is a name to go with this DNA. Come forward and identify this person to assist in solving this case of a pregnant woman.
Thanks to the growing databases, Toronto police were able to find a match, and earlier this year, in 2025, they arrested Ronald Gordon Ackerman. The now 50-year-old truck driver from Newfoundland was arrested at the airport as he was coming home from a 2-week trip. Another DNA sample taken after his arrest confirmed the first match, finally answering the question of who killed Donna Oglive. Now charged with first-degree murder, Ronald will have to face the consequences and hopefully explain the terrible decision he made in 1998 to end a young mother's life. On August 25th of 1975, a family in Baltimore, Maryland, was in distress. 20-year-old Roseann Sturtz had been missing for hours, and nobody was able to locate her. Anxious about this uncharacteristic lack of communication from her, the family reported Roseann missing. The search for her was unsuccessful until December 15th of that same year, when skeletal remains were located in a wooded area just off an industrial park. A sketch was composed by the police based on the remains found in hopes that someone would help them identify the victim. Family and friends of Roseann were quick to respond. The victim had to be their missing daughter and friend. The investigation retraced Roseann's steps back to a bar where she was recognized by other patrons. Police believed that she had met her killer at the bar and at some point left with them before being strangled to death. But locating said killer was proving to be a challenge. The first lead came in 1981 when Charles Davis, an inmate at a correctional institute, was identified as a potential suspect. Charles was incarcerated for very similar murders in the Baltimore area, and police wanted to find out if Roseann was another one of his victims. The suspect was recorded on tape and had been promised immunity from this case in exchange for information about her. Charles was already serving life sentences for other murders since 1978, so the family just wanted answers. However, when this lead was pursued, it returned no answers, since Charles said that he didn't recognize Roseann on the photo he was shown during his interview. With that lead coming to a dead end, investigators were back where they started. Cold case detectives revisited the case recently and came across the 1981 tape again. Since Charles Davis is behind bars, they decided to interview him again concerning the case of Roseann Sturtz, and this time, when shown a different picture of her, he nodded his head confirming this was in fact the woman he had murdered in 1975.
That's her, isn't it, Charlie?
So she still had a scar.
While the immunity he was promised doesn't allow for prosecution in the case of the murder of Roseann Sturtz, Charles Davis is already serving life sentences for other murders he committed around the same time, but the Sturtz family now have the answers they have been searching for the past 50 years. On Monday, the 20th of September of 2004, at around 11:30 in the morning, a man walking along the Selgill Beck stream in North Yorkshire, England, found something he thought he would never see up close: a dead body. The body belonged to a woman who seemed to have been in the water for 2 or 3 weeks by the time she was found. The cause of her death was not initially apparent, as there were no signs of violence that suggested she had intentionally ended up in the stream. Little did police know, this story would end up becoming a huge mystery among the locals. A mystery that has just been solved. A closer look at the body gave investigators the first details about the case. The woman was believed to be between 25 and 35 years old, of Southeast Asian origin, with dark, shoulder-length hair and standing at about 4 feet 11 inches. She was wearing green jeans and a green and white striped t-shirt, as well as a wedding ring, meaning someone must have been looking for her. What the autopsy couldn't reveal, though, was the exact cause of death, making it hard to start an investigation and determine if this was a missing persons case or a homicide. Immediately after the discovery, the police started an extensive investigation, questioning neighbors house to house as well as local holiday accommodations. However, no sign of her or anyone looking for her could be found. As time went by, the search within the English borders was proving unsuccessful, so in December of 2004, the police made an updated photograph of the victim based on her remains and sent it out to the embassies of several Asian countries in hopes to extend the search and discover if the woman had family abroad. The BBC show Crime Watch also featured the case, but once again, nobody came forward with any information. Over the years, the mysterious woman became a local sensation, earning her the name of the Lady of the Hills. Meanwhile, investigators were struggling to keep the case alive. In 2016, a further analysis of the victim's remains done years after being found determined she might have grown up in Thailand. So in 2018, investigators issued messages using social media and translated the information in hopes to get the information to travel across the world. And this time, they finally got an answer. On the 22nd of January 2019, a family in Thailand came forward with the belief that they knew the identity of the victim. The woman had married a British man in 1991 and moved to northwest England in 1995. But what really caught the police's attention was something her mother said. She had not heard from her daughter since 2004. Following this lead, the family offered DNA samples to hopefully identify the woman as their missing family member. And surely enough, it was a match. The Lady of the Hills was actually Lamduam Armitage, her last name being taken from her husband, British lecturer David Armitage, whom she had married in Thailand and later moved to England with. Her mother, Chumsi, also said that before she disappeared, Lamduam often called home to tell her that her husband abused her. The first thing police did was of course locate David, but when talking about his wife, he denied having anything to do with her death. Lamduam and David had 2 children together, and according to him, his wife left him and disappeared. After she allegedly took off, David had moved back to Thailand to teach English at a university. However, the lack of other explanations as to how or why Lamduam ended up in the stream were enough to make David the prime suspect in the case. After refusing to speak to investigators any further, the North Yorkshire police worked alongside the Thai authorities to arrest David Armitage and deport him back to the United Kingdom. On February 2nd, 2025, David Armitage landed in Heathrow Airport and was arrested. The now 61-year-old was released on conditional bail while he awaits further charges on this case. Meanwhile, the police are gathering all the information they can to officially charge David and seek justice for Lamduam.